And it came to pass when Joshua was by Jericho that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, there stood a man over against him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went unto him and said unto him, Art thou for us, or are you for my enemies? And he said, Neither one of you. I'm the captain of the hosts of the Lord, and I have come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and did worship, and said unto him, What saith my Lord unto his servants? And the captain of the Lord's host said unto Joshua, Loose thy shoe from off thy foot, for the place whereon thou standest is holy. And Joshua did so. Can you say amen? I want to talk about recognizing God in the middle of the battle, or recognizing God in the battle. To recognize God in the battle. Understanding that you are not in it by yourself, but that God is there with you in the midst of the battle. You don't have to handle this by yourself. You don't have to go up against the enemy in your own strength. If you just calm yourself down, God's going to get some glory out of this in spite of you. Amen? And you have responsibility. And to him whom much is given, much is required. And so as you lead, the problem with leading, it means that you are continually facing new things. If you're not continually facing new things, you're not leading, you're repeating. And if you are really a leader, you are progressive. And in the process of being progressive, it means that you are facing new issues in new areas all the time. Isn't it amazing how your greatest strength in the wrong place can become your greatest weakness? You cannot lead into greatness with small-mindedness. You cannot go forward with your feelings on your sleeves. You got to be able to feel your emotions and still control them. We all have them, but you cannot be controlled by your emotions and be an effective leader. Many times when God starts training you, he trains you with trouble, exposing you to various degrees of frustrating situations and then critiquing your response. See, some people don't have that back end. Critiquing your response so that you can learn how you should have handled this particular situation. You want to make sure that you have found a place that is appropriate where your strength skills and your skill sets and strengths can be utilized effectively. And yet we have a problem becoming so practical that we don't recognize God in the middle of our situation. To not discern God as being a part of the process is a crippling mistake that Joshua is about to make here, because he thinks he's just running into man and he's running into God. Have you recognized God in your situation? Or are you so practical, and are you so busy dealing with man and dealing with processes and dealing with budgets and dealing with facts and dealing with figures and dealing with the principal at the school and dealing with the problem down at the hospital and dealing with this and that or the other, that you don't know that there is a spiritual dynamic to winning? When God gets into the midst of your goals and the things you're going after, it helps you to be more effective. The hardest thing in the world to do is to balance between what is my responsibility and what is God's responsibility. So the first thing I have to do is to recognize God in the situation. And once I have recognized that God is there, even in situations that look quite natural to me, that look like a man to me, that God could show up as a man and me not recognize it. And the second thing is for me to distribute responsibilities appropriately, and I begin to understand what is my business and what is God's business. See, the disciples messed up that first thing because whenever Jesus showed up in another form, they didn't recognize him. And when you keep doing new things, God keeps showing up in new forms. And they don't know that God could use somebody that wasn't a missionary, that wasn't an evangelist, that God could use somebody who wasn't even a Christian to bless you and to speak a word into your life, that God can use your enemies, that sometimes God speaks through your children, that sometimes God will speak to you through a commercial, that sometimes God will speak to you through people that you would never think possible, and they're not open to new experiences. And whenever God does something fresh, they go back to something old. And so they have a Moses' mentality of wandering around a mountain that's safe rather than to have a contemporary, ongoing experience with God. You have to face new things to have a prayer life. You have to face something that makes you vulnerable and insecure to have a prayer life. You have to come before God not being a know-it-all to have a prayer life. Some of you can't pray because you are so convinced that you know how to do everything. You don't pray. You just go to God and brag. You know, I got this. How many of you are facing new challenges? New challenges is a sign of progress. It's a sign of going into another dimension. But don't expect your old ideas about God to show up in your new situation, because the God that you need in the storm is not the God that you need in Gennesaret. He may come to you walking on the water and he may look like a ghost, but don't be afraid of him, because God does show up in other forms. Don't be afraid to see God in other forms. Don't be afraid to recognize God when he walks through a door and eats fish with the disciples, and they're afraid that he's a spirit. And he says, no, can a spirit eat fish? Touch my side, touch my hand, be not faithless but believe. See, when you go into new experiences, we have a tendency to be afraid. It's not about how you can get God to support your agenda. It's about you getting on your knees and finding out what is God's agenda and seeing how you can support what God is doing. See, some of you think you're winning because you're such a good fighter, but you're not winning because you're such a good fighter. You're winning because somebody's in a secret closet praying for you, causing you to prevail over your enemy. Oh my God. Your perspectives on where you are based on where you've been. So you read into it a prejudged disposition based on past experiences. And now God's brought you into a place that he is demanding maturity. I define maturity as balance. He's demanding maturity. He's demanding that you understand that you're not going to whip everything with your sword. That you can't just assign God a post in your army, using him for your agenda. That this is not about you. The thing that you are up against right now is not about you. Now, the battle is not yours. It belongs to God. That doesn't mean that you don't have to show up for the fight. It just means that ultimately the victory that you seek is not your victory. It is the victory because God has a purpose in you getting the victory over this situation. It is not you that's getting the victory. It is God that's getting the victory. And you're not using God to get your victory. God is using you to get his victory. And as soon as you get that straight, you can get down to business. And it is a sign, not that they need to change, but it is a sign that I maybe need to get up 30 minutes earlier, an hour earlier, spend a little bit more time in his presence, get my core back, get my center straight, get my priorities in place so that I can work from a position of strength and not a position of strain. But until you recognize that God is in the midst of the battle and you humble yourself and say, Lord, I'm here to serve you. How would you use me to get the victory in this situation? Why must the warrior, in spite of his skill set, be faced with the battle that you cannot win through your skill set alone? Because it teaches you to pray. Before you go against Jericho, Joshua, you must have an encounter with God. You are going to come because you understand that the battle you fight tomorrow necessitates that you spend some time in the presence of God, being directed and motivated and filled and charged with the mind of God, how to get the victory on tomorrow. I will never see the walls of Jericho come down until I have this experience with God. I will never see my credit come down, my debt come down, my tumors come down, my crisis come down, my curses come down, unless I have an encounter with God.